What I want to do today with this video is give you a brief overview of the water treatment process dealing with conventional or direct filtration. I'm actually at a direct filtration plant right now, and the difference between the two is conventional filtration has the processes of coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation, and filtration, whereas direct filtration, which can be used with source waters that are lower in turbidity, cuts out the sedimentation process. So it goes coagulation, flocculation, and filtration. So starting from this plant, we're assuming that we're taking the water, and the water is coming from its sources, which could be creeks, it could be the lakes, rivers nearby, or whatnot. And it's kind of important to understand what we're trying to do here before I talk about exactly the processes of doing it. If you look right down here, you see that large green pipe that goes up the side of that concrete structure. That's where the raw water enters the treatment plant at. And it's kind of important to understand raw water in its natural state as well, because basically raw water, when it's in its natural state, has a bunch of what's called turbidity in it. And turbidity is cloudiness of water. And this turbidity contains these fine particles that resist settling due to a number of things. One is they have a negative charge. The particles have a negative charge, not so much the water itself, but they have a negative charge in them, and so they kind of bounce off each other, you might say. They repel each other like opposite ends of a magnet might repel each other. Also, they're just little fine, very, very light particles. And as such, the water churns them up when it moves them around. This turbidity in the water contains a lot of things other than just the dirt and silt that we do not want in the water. It contains organic matter from plants or animals. It can contain pesticides. It can contain inorganic matter like mercury or so forth, or biological contaminants such as bacteria, viruses, and protozoans. So together, this whole cluster of things that we do not want, we call that turbidity. And the goal with treating this water is to remove all the turbidity from the water so that what you end up with safe, potable drinking water. So when the raw water first enters the plant, in this case here, it's coming up through that one pipe, and it enters something that's called a flash mixer. So here we are at the flash mix, and the flash mix is where the first step in the treatment process, known as coagulation, takes place. Coagulation is a chemical process, and I was saying how the fine particles in the raw water have a slight negative charge to it, which makes them basically resist each other. Well, what we do with the flash mix here is we add in chemicals that have a positive charge. And like I said, this is a chemical process, and it's a heavily mixing process. So we add in these chemicals that have a positive charge, and we mix the water very, very vigorously in there. We can also add certain other chemicals that we might need in here, like this particular one uses alum as a coagulant. They also add Cat C, and what that does is it forms particles that kind of stick together a little better to cause heavier flock. Also, a little bit of chlorine for pre-disinfection is added here. By adding chlorine at the head for pre-disinfection, you can control tastes and odors, slime growths in the process, and it gives you a little more contact time for the killing of bacteria. So what's going on in this flash mix here is the alum is added to the water, which has a positive charge, and it's being mixed together very, very vigorously. And what's happening is the water and everything in there is banging together, and the positively charged alum in the water is banging around, and it's collecting together with those negatively charged ions in the water and forming flock particles. There's a very exact science to this. Really, the water should maintain in this flash mix for the coagulation process no more than about 30 seconds. You need 30 seconds for enough contact time for this stuff to bash together, but if you take too long here, the flock is going to get mixed too mix too vigorously, mix too vigorously and could actually start to break apart. So I'm actually standing right on top of the flash mix, and you can see right in here is where the water is coming in, chemicals are added, everything's getting mixed together. After the water leaves that flash mixer where it's been vigorously mixed, the water leaves there and it heads on to the next step in the treatment process, which are the flocculation basins. Now the flocculation basins are a mechanical mixing process. We form that flock in that flash mixer, but what we want to do in these flocculation basins is form a heavier flock through a continued mixing, but not a mixing that's so strong that it's going to break that flock apart. So we want a very, very gentle mixing. This particular flock basin here mixes the waters through a series of baffles. You see two separate cells here. There's one on that side, and then on this side of the brick wall, there's another one. Now, on the other side of me here, there's another two cells. So there's actually 4 different cells of flock basins here. However, generally, they use one at a time, and this way you can take one offline for cleaning or whatnot. So basically what happens is the waters, you take one of these cells in itself, and you see these wooden chambers. These wooden chambers divide each cell up, and if the water were a little clearer, you might see through as you go to the other side. They get clearer and clearer as some of that flock does settle out. But basically what you have under the water here is a series of chambers, and in these walls they'll have little holes that allow the passage of water from one side to the other. So on this wall right here, the hole may be down near the bottom on the bottom left, and then the water comes into this chamber, and to go out the other wall, it's at the upper right. And then on this next one here, it may be at the bottom left again. And as we go over here, it may be on the upper right. The detention time of the water passing through these flock basins is generally about 15 to 45 minutes. Now that depends on the flow. This particular plant flows 30 million gallon capacity. Right now it's flowing about 11 million gallons of water through it. So it's not really ripping at high speed right now. So you're gonna have a little longer detention time going through these flock basins here. On the end of these flock basins, the water skims over the top of these weirs, and were this to be a complete conventional filtration plant, they would then go to the sedimentation basins. Now, I'm not going to talk about sedimentation here, and there's a few things that I wish I could talk about that because of the time restrictions, I'm not going to be able to talk about. But if you're enjoying this and you want to hear the whole process in detail, I do have a podcast at the Water Sifu. It's podcast number 3, Water Treatment Overview, where I had all the time I want to explain everything in good detail, and we go more into the conventional filtration there. Remember, this being direct filtration, there is no sedimentation, so it goes through the coagulation of the flocculation straight to the filtration bed. So the water runs down here and heads to the filter beds. Kind of looks like the log ride at an amusement park or something like that, huh? And it heads over to the filter beds, and that's where we're gonna head next. So we're on top of the filter beds now. This particular filter bed consists of 8 individual cells. This is that trail that of water that we just saw leaving the flocculation basins. It comes down here and it splits into 2 separate kind of round things there that divide into 4 cells each. Now basically how this works is the water comes in and it divides either way it's going to go, and it comes into this trowel here. If you see this structure right here, this vacuum tank right here creates a suction, and as that vacuum creates a suction, it sucks the water over the trowel and down into the other side, which then feeds into the individual filter cells. Now that is how we basically bring a cell online, is we create that suction and the water pulls into those filter cells. And when you want to take a filter offline, they basically break that suction, and that air gap between them is gone. Let's take a look at one of our individual filter cells and kind of see how it works. So here we are looking at inside of a filter cell. The structure that you see in there, this trowel, that's used for backwashing the filter cell, and we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, when you have conventional filtration or filter beds like this that are gravity filters, they work on a process of kind of gravity and adsorption and micro-straining. So the weight of the water above it is what pushes the water down through the media. In this case, it's a monomedia, which means it has gravel and just sand on top of that one media. The most common monomedia is sand. And so the weight of the water pushes the water through the filters down below into the finished water. Now, a lot of people think that that's all filtration is just pushing the water and the filter filters it out, kind of a micro-straining process. That is part of it, but that is far from the most important part of filtration and how that works. Basically, the biggest part of filtration and how it would work on a filter bed like this is something that's called adsorption. If you remember when I was talking way back at that flash mix, I was saying that raw water in its natural state has no charge, but the particles in raw water have a slightly negative charge. So we add those positively charged ions to the water in the form of coagulants. In this case, we're using alum, and they bang together and they start to collect those negative ions and form that flock. So what happens is those negative ions that are still left come down here and they hit the filter bed and they get buried into the filter bed as the water is pushing through. So they get filtered out and they bury themselves into those filter beds at separate levels. And as any other negative particles come along, they kind of catch them and hang on to them. Now, when I talk about adsorption, I'm not talking about the word with a B to absorb, but adsorption with a D. That's the collection of a solid, liquid, or gas on the surface or interface zone of another material. So basically what happens is they collect those things and catch them in the filter beds. Now there's going to come a time when a filter is caught as much stuff as it's going to catch. And that's when you know it's time to backwash that filter. When it's time to clean that filter out. There's generally three things that we use to determine when it's time to backwash a filter. The time that filter's been running, or you could think of that as the gallons that filter's produced. Turbidity, if the effluent turbidity starts to rise a little bit on that filter, or head loss. Now, when I talk about head loss, I mean the filtrate, the water coming out of the other side starts to slow down. It's not as great. And basically you can see that by the water level inside the filter beginning to rise. So if you look at the wall right there, I can't even see this right now. I hope you guys can see this because the sun is killing me. All right, now if you can see the water level on the wall there, as that water level starts to rise up, you may have 45 inches of water in it, and then you get up to 56 or 57, you know that you have a head loss on the other side, so you know the media is becoming clogged up with stuff and it's time to backwash it. After the water leaves the filters, you can add whatever chemicals you need to add to the water. Some places will add fluoride to the water. Some places add chemicals for corrosion control. In this case, what we're at, we add a post-chlorination dose, so they add chlorine to the water to continue to add a disinfectant ability to that water in case there's any of those harmful bacteria, viruses, or protozoans that might be in the water. It's very important to have a chlorine residual in the water to kill off anything in there. And then the water is sent to a holding tank, which is called a clear well. In this case, that is the clear well. And what the clear well does, it allows for contact time before going out into the system, so that anything that might still be in the water has time for that chlorine to react with it and kill it. This plant here has two clear wells. There's that one right there, and there's another one there on the other side of that wall. Now there's this great thing in front of me that looks like it'd be skateboarder's paradise. If you're asking what that is, that's what they call an off-spec basin. If for some reason turbidity starts to rise in the plant or effluent chlorine looks like it's going to go low, this is a catch-all. Instead of directing water into the clear well, they can direct the water into this off-spec basin while everything gets caught back on track. Monitoring is an essential part of any water treatment processes, and there's monitoring that goes on through the entire process. What we have here is a set of turbidity meters that can monitor the influent water, which they call the raw water, the effluent water or the treated water, and also every single one of those 8 filter cells has its own individual turbidimeter. Basically the water flows through here and it can tell you the turbidity and what's going on in each of those cells. Also there's chlorine monitoring that monitors the pre-chlorine dose and the post-chlorine dose for the chlorine that goes out to the clear well. When we backwash a filter bed, basically what happens is, first off, the inlet to the filter bed is closed. The effluent side of the filter bed is closed. I should say by inlet, meaning that connection is broken so water's not flowing into it. The effluent valve is closed, and you go through what's called a drain period, where you drain down the water. The water drains to a wash water collection tank. Then what happens is valves open up on the bottom of the filter, and air and water begin to become injected into the filter from the bottom side. So instead of things flowing down from the top, that's why it's called a backwash. You're washing from the bottom back up, and it expands that filter bed material. As that filter bed material expands, remember I said the filter was drained down, so these troughs you see in the water are actually right above at the skim of the water level. And as you expand that media, everything that's captured in it, all those particles and junk and flock and turbidity, everything you've caught in there, expands with it and floats to the surface and gets basically captured in that trough and carried to the wash water collection tanks, along with the water that was first sent when it drains down. An important thing to do while you're draining and during the backwash process is to make sure you surface wash. So you want to make sure that you see right here that there's a hose out on the ground, and that's what that hose is for washing the surface, washing the sides of the bin. As you do that, if you do not process or wash the surface properly through the process, you can have the creation of what's called mud balls, which can cause breakthrough and other material down the road in the filters. So after the media has been expanded and all that stuff is flowed off to the wash water collection basins, then you go through a period where you bring the filter back into service. You still have not sent it to the effluent yet, to the treated water side, but you put the water back into the filter bed. You allow water to flow into it for a while, so it goes through a ripening period where those positively charged flock particles are allowed to kind of embed into the sand again. And then after you go through that certain amount of period, you return the filter to service. So backwash is actually going on now, and you can see this is the actual drain system. The water is draining out of here. The inlet flow has been shut off. The water is being drained into the wash water collection basin. You just heard the vacuum over here open up. It's actuating the valves. And you can see actually as the water is coming up from the bottom, you can actually see the particles, the material coming up and soaking and flowing right over into those troughs. So if you look right in there, you can actually see the materials flowing up over into those troughs and being taken away. In the interest of time, I can't show as much of this as I would like to, but you kind of get the hint. Now it's in full backwash mode. The water's coming back up from the bottom. The air is coming up through the media, expanding the media. You see how the water is very kind of muddy looking, and all that water that's flowing up is flowing through those troughs, being collected and sent to the wash water. So the last thing I want to cover is what happens to the water from the backwash. What happens when the cell drains down, and what happens to all that dirty water once it leaves those troughs. At the plant, the water leaves those troughs and it goes into a wash water collection tank. From that wash water collection tank, it gets pumped to lagoons, and there are 2 of them here, as you can see, through an influent piping on the other side. Can I get it? There you go. Through some influent piping right there, it enters these lagoons. It has a little bit of time to settle in these lagoons, and then on timer, there's a kind of an arm that scrapes the bottom of this, and sludge pumps underneath pump to these drying beds over here, which allow the water to settle down and the dirt and everything to dry in. Now once these get filled up, they just get kind of cleaned out and the dirt gets hauled away in there. So that's kind of what happens once that water leaves the backflow process, and the backwash process. And then from here, the water kind of gets recycled. These are some plate settlers right here, and there's a whole series of these right here, and the water kind of drains through these, and it allows the particles or anything that might be in the water to settle out on these plates, and the water collects through a trough and goes into a sump over here. And then from there, that opens up and drains that water back to the inlet at that treatment plant, and they blend that with the treated water as they bring it into the inlet of the plant, so nothing really gets wasted there. So that should give you a good overview of the treatment process. I didn't have nearly the time I wanted to. Again, that was direct filtration, coagulation, flocculation, and filtration. If you add the sedimentation after flocculation, you basically have an overview of conventional filtration. I'd encourage you, if you want to see this in even greater detail, to go check out the podcast. Again, due to the time restrictions here, I got to kind of keep this short. watersifu.com is the website, SIFU. So it's sifu.com. It's episode 3. Water treatment overview. You can also find the Water Sifu podcast in iTunes or in the BlackBerry store. Have a good day, and we will catch you later.